It's fashionable to valorize innovation, revolution, and disruption. However, I'm uncomfortable with disorienting change. I want stability and continuity. Reality frequently reminds me that it doesn't intend to cooperate. I've always struggled with the contradiction between my desire for order and my acceptance of its frailty. That's a quote from the bio page that Adam Elkus wrote to explain some of his work and research interests. I feel very much the same. Adam is a researcher focusing on challenges in security technology and alternative analysis. He lives in the Washington, D.C. area and posts on Blue Sky under the handle AE. I've linked his account in the show notes. For some time now, I've really enjoyed and agreed with many of the thoughts that he shared about our current political, cultural moment, and a few weeks ago, he made a thread about detective fiction that spoke to my interests as a guy who tried and failed to use detective fiction to teach undergraduates about epistemology as a graduate student. I promised you I would get more aggressive about inviting people onto the show, so I reached out to ask if he would come talk with me about what he's been reading. The conversation moved quickly and covered a lot of ground, and I think that you'll enjoy it. Check the show notes for a hopefully relatively complete list of the many books, movies, TV shows, and comic books we referenced in the course of our conversation. I should maybe note, because the title was only mentioned glancingly, that a big chunk of our conversation hangs on a novel called There Is No Anti-Memetics Division by QNTM. I'll see you on the other side of the very dignified theme music that Tracy Rae Bowling so kindly made for me.
I'm a huge fan of like genre. I wouldn't say it's genre fiction because that's a very slippery label, but things like cyberpunk and weird horror are kind of things that I generally like reading a lot. But the other things that I tend to enjoy are sort of novels that have a way like a in high school was a term called world fiction in the sense of trying the idea of the novel encompassing a kind of a full environment that represented the spirit of the times. It's a very kind of awkward term. As an example of that is Alfred Kubin's The Other Side. And he was a very big influence on Kafka and a lot of other people, actually. But kind of the two sort of founders of weird fiction are considered like the Lovecraft branch and the Kubin branch. I mean, Lovecraft having one way of, and Kubin the much more sort of like a European surrealist way. And the book is it's a very insane book. And it begins with a guy being invited to move to a town started by his best friend who got rich in Central Asia, and then ends with just a giant epic battle that like a surrealistic battle between two kind of like kaiju figures. It looks very much like the anime End of Evangelion if you've ever watched it. And this was written in 1907.
Yeah, I was just looking this because to my shame, I don't think I'm familiar with this author, and I saw born April 10, 1877, died August 20, 1959. So I was thinking like the timing on this has got to be bizarre. So 1907, we've got mecha fights.
Similar examples like 20 Days of Turin and The Glass Bees. I mean, they're all vaguely dystopian novels that that they're all extremely prescient in very odd ways. And the author through the style, tries to sort of create, again, like a full enclosure. But that's one sort of side of things. The other is the more sort of experimental science fiction and weird fiction niche. I think a lot of people and like that you and I follow on Blue Sky sort of fall into. A lot of Ring is like the Ring novels, and very big Neuromancer, like a classic. So it's kind of and also one of the last kind of things, I kind of like detective fiction a lot. One of the things I brought recently is actually a Dashiell Hammett Maltese Falcon, that sort of stuff. That's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Yeah, that's a big edition of the Maltese Falcon, which I guess I haven't read, so maybe it's a longer book than I'm imagining. But the The edition I picture when I think of it is definitely one of those kind of low profile paperbacks. Has that one got some additional materials or annotations or anything?
It's the Maltese Falcon, Thin Man, and Red Harvest.
Ah, okay, that explains it. Yeah, one of the reasons that I know I kind of DM'd you insofar as Blue Sky has DMs out of the blue, and part of the reason I think was for the timing that I had enjoyed your observations about how mystery detective fiction in particular works. I have a long-term fascination with the genre, though it's at a bit of a remove because it's one of those things where I thought maybe I would be a mystery writer. Like the third failed book that I wrote back in like college, or maybe the fourth, I honestly don't know anymore, was a really weird detective story about a unit in Atlanta that investigates snuff films, and the one of the detectives is a magician, not the kind that does actual magic, just the kind that does tricks. And they find a unicorn dead at the feet of a statue of the founder of the Coca-Cola company, and then they have to figure out who killed the unicorn. And I really thought this was going to be an area that I worked in, but I feel like I often ended up much more interested in the theory of how you would put one of those together than in the practice of actually doing the work of assembling a mystery. I'm terrible at putting together mysteries, actually.
Yeah, there's a very big difference, I think, between people who are attracted to sort of the like atmosphere or aesthetic of detection versus more of the actual like mechanical trap aspect of the genre. I mean, a lot of I was about a month ago. I was reading the Woman in White, like a Wilkie Collins, and in the opening of it, there was a comment somewhat dismissive from another novelist saying that he developed everything in his head before he wrote it, like it's just an elaborate mechanical object. And I think that some people have a bit of pleasure and talent for doing that, others not. I mean, I definitely know that I enjoyed Inherent Vice for precisely the reasons it was not like that.
Right. Yeah, no, I find the mechanical stuff extremely stressful. I think the fact that I'm going to be accountable in the future for the decisions that I make early on, it's a lot easier for me to deal with in a less structured genre where if I don't like the results of a decision, I can go back and change it and I won't have to rethink every other choice I've made
Mhm.
in the time since. Whereas, I mean, and I know that some people will say that they have worked out the whole thing in advance. I tend to assume that most of them are going through a lot of the same sort of trial and error that you would with other kinds of fiction, and then they're going back and they're hiding their tracks, right? But it is extremely intimidating to me to feel that it does have to at the end all come together in a way that makes sense.
That's sort of the kind of the classical school of detection where the idea is that the classical ideal detective is that there is hidden order and everything may appear ambiguous and amorphous at the start, but it's not because you're looking at it the right way. And someone, a sufficiently skilled viewer, like Sherlock Holmes, obviously, eventually writes everything and explains everything. And I think that that's very much what the actual commercial success of detective fiction always has been. More avant-garde stuff has been more of a niche taste. And I think a lot of writers tend to sort of fall into the middle where they don't want to be they want to have a totally sort of abstract venture, but they're also not really that keen on making a sort of mechanical trap either. And that middle ground is very hard to get in. It sometimes gets squeezed to death.
Yeah. Well, and like Sherlock Holmes is a really, I mean, obviously it's the example, but the thing that I often think of with Sherlock Holmes in particular is that there is I taught a class back when I was in grad school for undergrads where I tried to teach them about the concept of epistemology by way of detective fiction. And it wasn't particularly successful. I wasn't, where I needed to be able to explain that to undergrads, and undergrads were not probably where they needed to be to really latch onto the idea of epistemology.
Yeah.
But it was really, I was more anxious then than I am now. But I still feel some anxiety about the sort of like political implications of a person like Sherlock Holmes being able to look at the world, see the important information, extract the details that matter, and understand everything, and then be able to kind of master and control everything. It's a way of seeing the world that suggests a level of perfect knowledge and of power won through perfect knowledge that is like really kind of scary, right? So there's a way in which I find that approach really off-putting. But I at the same time, like as I get older, I feel like less and less like the Sherlock Holmes readers of the world are probably the ones out in the streets
Yeah.
doing the fascism, right? Like that's not really how it works.
Yeah, another thing about kind of, I mean, something that's kind of been observed from the very beginning of the detective genre is the reason why the detective is a popular figure for writers is he can go anywhere and see anything by sort of by power. He's empowered to look and examine into things that other types of characters would not have. I mean, a detective can flash a warrant, or if a private investigator, even if they don't necessarily have official power, they have some sort of like semi-official ability to snoop in other people's business as their actual trade. And that like you can a lot that's partially why some writers are attracted to detection because it's a way of examining society and being subversive because the detective is a figure that can be a camera for the reader. But at the same time, there's also sort of like the more thing is that detective is just sort of the snoop. And
Yeah.
I'm a very big fan of like Japanese approach to this. I mean, I've which has very been actually influential in anime because it tends to kind of thread the needle between detective as surveillance and detective as social camera very well, even if it can sometimes be a little bit like a didactic.
I've read a little bit about Japanese detective fiction, but I haven't actually read any of the key works. Is there like one writer in particular that is your favorite of that set?
Edogawa Rampo, I don't know his full. I'm not probably mangling the name. He's sort of a kind of a. He's very much sort of like a mixture of Edgar Allan Poe and others. But I haven't really read as widely in the genre as I'd like. Mainly, Kobo Abe is the primary person. There's a book called by Margaret Key, her doctoral dissertation, which she describes his theory of detection.
Mm-hmm.
He's the person in terms of like just sort of film, Mamoru Oshii and the Ghost in the Shell thing is a very big favorite of mine. But that's sort of like that's kind of where the dilemma is. And my friend Brett Fujioka, who probably also may follow, is someone who's much more knowledgeable about the genre and also much more well read in it.
About the one that you showed, so you're reading Dashiell Hammett right now. What is the kind of difference that marks him out from some of the other writers in this genre? What has been really what have you enjoyed in reading him?
So I am not sure if this is necessarily a difference, but it's something I tend to just notice when I read Maltese Falcon. I'd never actually read the novella. I mean, I'd watched the movie numerous times. When I read the novella, the thing I noticed about Sam Spade was that the actual architecture in the back of the novel is more or less about information search in more of the technical sense, like Google and or increasingly LLMs. And you're looking at it at a world where none of these things exist, but the actual functions are the same. Most of the time, the things that Sam Spade spends his time doing are calling a switchboard operator or accessing some sort of centralized store of information and saying, give me this or give me that, and offering commands to some sort of figure that acts in the role of a computation device. And most of the things that he actually does are simply piecing all those together. His actual investigation as a private eye in that novel is somewhat scattershot. He spends a lot of the time getting beaten up or pulling guns on people. And the main character, like the female lead, is just spend like every single word out of her mouth is a lie from the very beginning. And a lot of the time I can sort of see that actually what makes him successful is more or less his ability to search out and structure information in mechanical or computer-like sense. And that's what I found most fascinating about it. I mean, a lot of the other stuff is more I mean, as a prose stylist, I think you also notice like a Dashiell Hammett very, very easily. It's a very cruel aspect how he describes things. He tends to accentuate the very kind of the sort of the grimy or pathetic aspects of the characters or how strong or vicious they are and how he describes them. The environments very much seem very hostile, just like a more like pure linguistic sense as well. And it's something I haven't read Red Harvest yet, but I'm imagining that's something that comes out. I haven't actually been as much of I've tried to actually read The Thin Man is also in there, but it hasn't really stuck for me as much. It feels much more like an extended cocktail party than kind of a detective thing.
I may have said I haven't really read him. I've got copies of books that, I look at them and I think, like, I know that this is near the top of the list, right? Like, I know that I should be investigating this and getting to know this writer because I enjoy a lot of things that are proximate. But I imagine reading the scene where the person has the gun pulled on them or he's getting beaten up, and it is, I always have something else I'm more excited to do is what I find.
I think it's also things enjoyable is that even though Sam Spade is a commanding figure in a physical and charismatic sense, I mean, there's a literary critic who my name is blanking on, distinguish between like fiction about intelligence agents versus intelligence agents against our will. It kind of, I mean, like there's one like versus James Bond. He's one director, or more just an ordinary person who's pulled into something that they don't understand and is sort of bumbling through things. I think that Sam Spade is in Maltese Falcon is very fascinating because he's a very professional, very commanding presence, but you as the reader feel like you're constantly being dragged through this like worsening nightmare, and and he's not in control of, and he only really gets control of towards the end. But a lot of them are situations where when the gun pulled, like he has to somewhat negotiate his way out of a hostile situation while also trying to extract information. Negotiations over information are a very big part of the novella, where he tries to get information out of someone and while also withholding information himself. And people try to play games of, can I get information from you while also withholding as much as possible? And there's explicit negotiations over it. So yeah, it's very interesting because that negotiations of information, also in mechanics of entry and search, just seem to be the biggest things that sort of stand out. Although that's also partly a function of my bias. I use Linux. I read a lot of computer science things and used to do computer simulation and modeling for like in graduate work. So it's a kind of a thing I also look for.
Yeah, I have felt an increasing tension between my access to information and my desire to write fiction. What I mean by that is, like, I mean, the classic example is one of the first things you have to do to make a lot of stories possible is make sure nobody's cell phone is working.
Yeah.
You have to be like, oh, the tower's down, or an EMP went off, or we just aren't getting a signal out here, weird, or oh, they took our phones. It is amazing how many genres, how many stories become really difficult to put together when it's not really so much of a special skill to be able to like get the basic facts of a situation anymore, right? The facts are kind of trying to present themselves to you. The skill now might be more in discerning what is real from what is false. But I feel like in the context of a fictional setting, that can be a difficult skill to explore in a way that's particularly exciting because the reader has already entered a state of suspended disbelief, right? They're willing to buy in on whatever you tell them. That's the contract that you've made with them as a reader of the fiction. They are looking to you for guidance on what is really happening. And so watching a character go through that same negotiation can be fun, but it can also just be really irritating. So I feel like there is for me a real attraction to older work. Like I've been reading a lot of stuff lately that is from well before the internet ever existed. I think partly because I enjoy the characters having a freedom from the kind of consciousness, the kind of information bath that I feel kind of trapped in these days.
I've kind of a different opinion about sort of the cell phone thing, and it kind of comes from more or less personal experience of, I mean, just put, like, kind of put it bluntly, that like a lot of people my age can be reduced to like have this one experience, at least name one point in their life in which they've been reduced to sheer panic from a delayed text message from someone, family member, a significant other, someone who's like someone whose response they care about, or if they get the text message, it's cryptic or they can't decipher it. And I feel that sort of that kind of that having instant access to information tends to highlight more the inherent communication barriers between individuals. And that's frustrating to readers in part because it kind of reminds them too much of their own lives.
Yeah.
that they don't want to be reminded of the fact that they went on a date, and that and the guy doesn't, and they're waiting for this text message from the guy, and he, when it comes back, instead of telling them a clear thing that tells him if he wants to go on another date with her, he just sort of fumbles. I mean, a lot of like women's criticism of dating apps tends to sort of like kind of as the specter of the figure of the fuck boy, who's sort of like perpetually ambiguous in his uses of communications technology while having sexual relations with them.
Right, right.
So, like, I mean, the thing is that people tend to not don't want to be reminded of that sort of thing they're dealing with constantly in their lives, but more of in a literary sense, that's really where communication barriers are. It's something like I don't believe that cell phones sort of include that. It's more just that people don't want to be reminded of it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean it's partly just I don't want to be reminded of it for sure. It's I mean I am as a digital correspondent, I am pretty bad. I will say like I when a person texts me, usually their experience is that I reply too late for them to have the information they want to have, right? Somebody will invite me to go hang out or something, and I'll see it early enough that I could get back to them and say, like, yeah, sure. But usually, like, I am so resentful of the kind of leash that constant access via texting sort of creates that I'll always like wait an hour before I say anything back to anybody. At which point, like often the thing that they have texted me about is really no longer relevant. So I'm probably I don't know if I'm quite a fuck boy. I'm married, so it that has mostly sorted itself out. But I think I am in a different category of annoying person to text with.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the other more thing of like the person who just takes too long to respond, or why they. I tend to sort of try to deal with that emotionally by thinking like I have no idea what's going on in someone else's life. All I have is a connection point. And I mean, it's very kind of, for me, like the fact that the Turing test, it was originally conceived of as basically over teletype communication.
Yeah.
And the person substituting their image of the other person through that to a point where a machine could sneak through is very, very important because it's a prefiguration of social media. So I try to give other people grace, and I don't know what's going on with their life. I don't know what their cognitive load is. I don't really know what their perception of me is. And what only matters is I kind of maybe kind of get something back and maybe like a business-like time frame, and then I'll see what they have doing and try to respond to it on its own merits.
Yeah, yeah. No, I feel like on some level I'm like performing that potential complexity, right? Like the reason I'm delaying is partly to say like, who you don't know what I've got going on. Maybe I'm having a hard day. Let's all give each other some space. I mean, by that same token, like the other side of that bad behavior is I do when I send somebody else a text, I consider it like I've dropped it in a well. Like
Yeah.
if I ever hear back, great. I'll almost be surprised. You know, you mentioned something that I've been thinking about off and on, and I keep meaning to research it. And I'm betting you know more about this than me. I'm almost positive. You mentioned the Turing test. It has been interesting to me that it feels like with the popularization of the large language model, it immediately became irrelevant. Like that test always sounded really smart to me in theory when I would read about it in science fiction, or you'd see a movie where we'd be like, okay, we're going to find out if the robot has reached that level of sophistication by seeing if it can trick people. And then the second we get remotely sophisticated, you know, artificial intelligence, or maybe you don't want to call it that, but whatever we've got, it turns out that it is extremely easy to fool people. And like, actually, that is a very low barrier to entry. And I no longer know how much that test means to me. Where are you at with the Turing test right now is I guess what I'm asking.
Well, I mean, first is sort of that, I mean, the actual paper is not really as well formalized as uncomputable numbers or other things. And so it's been notoriously difficult to operationalize. It's very written much a very conversational way. There's something kind of an influence of a computer science professor named Sean Luke at George Mason University. And he made like a point years ago on a discussion forum about interpretation of the Turing test that's always stuck with me. He said that most people misread it as being Turing's statement about something. I mean, it is to some extent. He had very well-known beliefs about machine intelligence, but it's mainly an intellectual trick. That what Turing is trying to do is to sort of say, all right, I'm going to try to create as most objective as possible situation where you try to acknowledge if something is intelligent or not. And the machine's going to try to assume that. If machine reaches this, either you have to bite the bullet and accept that it's intelligent, or you have to find a new definition of intelligence to exclude it.
Right, right.
And it's very much, and that it's just sort of it's more of a estrangement device essentially. And I think that the thing that's become irrelevant was sort of maybe Turing's presumption that the estrangement was needed. That, I mean, I think that people's ideas of what are intelligent are really inherently a moving target, and also sort of the idea of the Turing test in itself presuppose more of an image of computing as a whole that's kind of to people like me, it's still attractive, but to the mass public, it's never been that way. I mean, like a bit of an example, sort of that, like the famous quote by like a William Gibson, where he said that I mean, the famous story is he wrote Neuromancer and all those things before he actually owned a computer, didn't have enough money, and he also just wasn't interested. Finally, he becomes a big boy author, and he gets a computer, and it's some sort of like standard computer thing, like an Apple or whatever, and he gets really, really disappointed because he imagined all this thing with elaborate gears and cool, like the data deck and cyberdeck stuff, and or like the Voight-Kampff machine, those kind of things that are more obviously mechanical. And then you just have this little box, and it opens up the box. It's a printed circuit board. There's no levers, no gears, no moving. And I think a lot of it, I think kind of is that Turing test appeals to people more who are more of the kind of the computer as a physical object thing, which is ironic given the actual disembodied nature of it. Whereas with the mass public, the computer is more or less just sort of an extension of their minds. And like in the book, kind of the second self, I mean, the author says the computer is just simultaneously an external object, an extension of your consciousness, and people don't really give much reflection to it. So as soon as you get something that functions effectively in that way, I mean, they just sort of abandon interest in Turing test. But I do think it will come back because the thing about AI and computers in general is that people will always say that it solves one thing and then suddenly you find a bug and you go back to the drawing board.
The extended consciousness thing, I identify with that. For me, the big example on this has been that I have always had a really bad sense of like navigation, right? Like I'm really bad at remembering where things are. Basically, if I can't walk it from one end to the other, I find it almost impossible to feel confident that I correctly remember a route. Even if I do, like I need to be able to mentally just do every single step that gets me from here to there, or it might as well not exist for me. And so like when Yahoo Maps, I think was the first one that really got going, when that became popularized, I would drive around, and at this point I'm like 18 or something,
Mhm.
and I would have a printout of the Yahoo Maps instructions in the passenger seat, and I would occasionally like consult that at a red light to remind myself what I had to do next. And that was very stressful for me. And then when I finally got, years after everyone else, years and years after everybody else, I finally got a smartphone and I had access to Google Maps and it could GPS me around. I immediately forgot everything I knew about how to get anywhere because it was like, well, now I don't need to know. The robot knows for me, and it knows way better than I do. So I will, when I'm coming home from a slightly unfamiliar location, I will still GPS my way home. And I might turn it off when I get close-ish, but sometimes I'll just let it take me the whole way home, even when like I know more than half the route because I'm driving it every day. It's like, you know what? I appreciate that you're here with me, buddy, that you're my navigation friend.
It's the pleasure of being guided on rails, honestly. I mean, that you, even if you know the way back, that you have some other external hand steering you. And that can be a bad thing. I mean, I think that some people, I mean, like algorithm panic in 2010 just because of the feeling of that external hand pushing you in certain directions. But in other cases, it's more or less of the kind of feeling of sort of like a pleasing thing of kind of a wind pushing you forward or a rail you kind of move. Even and to some extent, people prioritize even the feeling of that, even if they already know. My problem with navigation is somewhat similar to yours. I have very bad sense, but also even when I memorize something, I cannot describe it to other people. Like tourists always ask me, like, which way to this? Even if it's like my neighborhood, I cannot tell them because I'm sort of like a missile. I have an inertial navigation system, but a missile can't talk to people. All I know is the way I'm going.
No, and when people try to give me directions, I find that equally challenging because I have like a really specific way that I think about these things. It's very literal. It's very like, there's a procedure. And of course, no one describes the exact landmarks that I would use. Nobody uses the exact sequence that I use. And so even when somebody is in the car with me telling me, turn right, there's always this ambiguity of like, do you want me to turn right Now, do you want me to turn right at the approaching intersection? Do you want me to do that little side street that's on the way? I need you to tell me exactly the thing that you want to happen, or I won't be able to handle it. Like my partner, whom I've been with for, gosh, it's not 20 years, but we're coming up on 20 years soon. They are just now like at the point where they can pretty much tell me how to get from A to B in a car. It's so hard.
Yeah, it's I mean it's the imprecision of language. I mean it's like people when people sort of say it's kind of like people kind of make analogies between algorithms and recipes. It's kind of it's superficially appealing, but I like for my problems with cooking are actually in a sense probably that they're actually not algorithms. An algorithm tells a computer exactly what to do. Whereas like, well, stir until it has like ready. What's ready, my man? And
Yeah.
you have to like it's just like it's fuzzy and like it's fuzzy or whatever. And of course, maybe kind of
Yeah.
maybe the LLM use or whatever will eventually get my mind to the place where I can now actually get like use cooking or whatever. But on sort of similar subject of sort of like exactness, like this is like I just started reading this. There is no anti-memetics division by QNT. I mean, it's
Uh
kind
huh.
of like the most talked about book among sort of like our vague sort of circles right now.
I've been seeing it around and I haven't been I think what's been happening for me is I haven't been totally sure why it was so talked about in as you described sort of our loose circles. Like I wasn't sure what the beginning of it was. It's felt like I was coming into a conversation late, and so I keep thinking like I should probably read that, but I don't even know why I should read that. So like catch me up. Why is this the subject?
So, I mean, it's adapted. So, in terms of like the sequence of like of this, I mean, how it was produced, it was adapted out of a series of vignettes written for the Secure, Contain, Protect Project (SCP). You know, it was a collective collaborative fiction writing, and it's originally in the SCP universe, which was then once it became popular, QNTM rewrote it to be independent of it and also have a much more linear story tying together the vignettes. And I think that it's become, the central premise of the story is that there's such things called anti-memes. Like memes are programmed to spread, whereas anti-memes are programmed to forget you. I mean, you see something like a monster and you even forget it exists. If you forget other things exist. And it's a way of that sort of idea or thing exerting control over you. SCP is sort of popular because it's a way of expressing sort of anomalous objects without sort of the baggage. Obviously, kind of weird fiction has been this escalating arms race between something becoming played out versus something being shocking. And so, like, internet audiences tend to sort of identify more with things that aren't really as like personalistic or they're things like creepypastas, where they kind of like more exist kind of in the information sphere, or anomalies or glitches rather than necessarily threatening creatures or monsters. And I think also in a time in which there's a climate on reality has been spread in part by information systems, this sort of fiction is sort of preeminent. There's one thing I kind of been talking about, though. I think that kind of the genre it's sort of in is becoming a little bit sort of obsolete. A lot, so you know how like all these sort of like science fiction horror things with the premise like a secret agency whose job is to contain threats that can't exist and
Right.
the wider public doesn't have to know about, right?
Right, right. So you've got like your Men in Black, Control, which is Control the game, is that kind
Yeah,
of derivative
control.
of the SCP thing? Okay. And yeah, some other examples that I'm blanking on as well. But yeah, it's a fun genre.
I think sort of that I mean, it's kind of born of sort of an idea that the things that don't really fit with modernity and like a rational autonomous subject are that's quarantined sort of the dark holes where it's no longer the older days. I mean, you obviously have that idea of these vast forests full of magical creatures and everywhere. Whereas now it's more as like the things where the dark things inhabit, they're either kind of like dark crevices, like you turn open a rock and you see some termites, or or they're sort of a shadow realm inhabited by agencies that exist to manage like sensitive compartmentalized information with sort of like a classification systems, Cold War style. And to me, it's always in a sense based on this sort of premise that is sort of that you can have these two things can exist in the same sphere, our world, like by putting a container lid over the dark, creepy things. Whereas, and I mean, the saying of like the motto of SCP Foundation is we are in the dark, so people can be in the light. Whereas, more as the world we live in right now is where any sense of containment between these two spheres is broken, and it's more like that the things have come out of the box. So I think to some extent that there hasn't been really any. There could be, maybe just beyond my knowledge, but I don't think there's any sort of fiction that's really kind of come to grips with that sort of sense of eruption. I do see some sort of like anime tends to have some examples of it, but in literary fiction, I haven't as much seen as like good examples of it.
Yeah, so like to take broad strokes on the sort of narrative, historical development of the genre that you're talking about, you mentioned like there's a time historically where the wilderness is where we imagine these strange, frightening things are. That's where we put the monsters. That's where Grendel is. That's where, if you go out there, you're officially on an adventure, and the adventure doesn't end until you've come back home out of the
Yeah.
forest, right? And then humans have destroyed quite a lot of the forest, right? There's really not a sense. There's nowhere in my daily life. I live in Iowa City. There is wilderness accessible to me, but I have walked it while playing disc golf, right? Like it's not. There's no menace possible there, and so then you start thinking of the wilderness, with the places where the monsters are hiding, as maybe they are narrow alleyways
Yeah.
downtown, right? They're places where people are having social and economic relations that I don't really understand. They are people who are living in the margins. There could be creatures living in those margins. And now there's, if I understand your argument, you're saying that we've kind of reached a moment where it feels like there really isn't a hiding place. Everything is just kind of out there, right? Like there are these little crevices and whatever, but nobody's really managing and containing them and keeping the creatures at bay. Instead, you get online and you just see what you see, and it's just they're all over the place. Am I kind of capturing it? How would you?
Yeah, yeah. I think that I think sort of like domestication thing. So like the anime Dead Girl Murder Farce, it begins with kind of like a very blunt depiction of saying that the reason why there are no more yokai in Japan is because the Meiji government murdered all of them. As a part of the modernization sequence to try to turn Japan to a modern state, they got rid of all the monsters. They slaughtered all of them, much in the same like this like their Aboriginal population. They genocided and. I always thought this kind of a very flat and useful metaphor for what the domestication of the supernatural, and there's even a paper by Alex Wen as a kind of a crack you like an IR theorist who talks about how called sovereignty in the UFO is like the idea that why governments deny UFOs exist because the acknowledgement of non-human life that is beyond humans domination or control unhinges the basis of the modern state. So that basically is, and that's the premise for I think containment fiction, like the scene in like at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you have the giant warehouse full of things, and the Ark is just one of them. The idea is just like just a place where you can put all these things that don't really fit with modernity, and which they'll stay. And maybe they'll kind of leak a bit, but you hire a professional like a man in black who then goes there, grabs it, and then puts the neuralizer, and then makes people forget they saw it. And the thing is that could only, you think about that maybe as a metaphor for things like content management or gatekeepers in general, that people's exposure to deviant content could be controlled or managed by these responsible institutions. And it never really was entirely true. I mean, like Philip K. Dick, as a novelist, was partially the idea of picked up people's schizophrenia as coming from their sense of being spied on or manipulated by information channels. But then again, it's still like information channel or something that someone spies on. Someone spies you from the TV in 1984. It's not really that there are things running out in the middle of nowhere killing people. And now I think sort of we are more in a stage where in a sense that the idea of a containment or separation or compartmentalization is gone. And it's just a nonstop psychic assault of grotesque or terrifying things. I mean, like Instagram, I don't use Instagram anymore because I feel like every time I go on Instagram, I'm stepping into a scene from one of my weird horror things. There are kind of these bizarre, distorted shapes of AI generated waifus that like the creature from like from Total Recall, like the mutants, and I can barely see my own friends' content.
Yeah.
And also now, obviously, on the streets in the U.S., there are people like groypers are now hired to become ICE agents. So the sense of being that could just be compartmentalized or contained off is really gone. And I think that is a very big contributor to people's stress. And people are still stuck in the containment paradigm because they're mentally used to the idea of the tension coming from can we contain this or not? Is containment possible? I mean, SCP is kind of as a Janus face on. I mean, it is possible in one sense because the objects are contained, but in another sense, it isn't. They break free. And you can see through reading a lot of the SCP entries that gradually there's very little distinction between the outside world and the world that's being contained. But it's more of an implicit thing. Whereas I don't think there's been as much of an effort to sort of describe what it feels like to be someone who lived in the pre-containment era and suddenly now is in the era where it's not contained anymore. It's more like it's comparable to the feeling of living in the Roman Empire and suddenly being in the era, I mean, like the Dark Ages. Like on the one hand, there's still things you observe, like the same buildings. Maybe some of the local landlords have become warlords or whatever, but you're in a totally different environment. And it's like the closest thing I've seen in movies is sort of like Dementis in Fury Road, and difference between him and the other warlord is that the other warlord, Immortan Joe. Immortan Joe is someone who's adapted to the idea of the wasteland. Immortan Joe is building a civilization on top of it, whereas Dementis cannot let go of his feeling of loss of the world that exists before. It's what drives him crazy, no matter how much he kills, butchers, rapes, steals. He can never displace that feeling of loss. If I was once living in civilization and now it's gone. That's why even the famous, like in this line, he barks at Imperator Furiosa and others, like, no hope, not for you, not for me, not for anyone. And I don't think that, I think that people have that sort of feeling of loss, but it hasn't really been expressed a lot in literary fiction. Or, of course, maybe it's, again, some sort of like a new, like a niche area, area that simply I'm not familiar with.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I don't know where that's happening. It feels like somebody should be talking about that somewhere. Now I'm thinking like, I don't know, should I write something about it? Because that is really interesting. One thing that does come to mind, and I was checking the date on this. I'm a huge fan of Satoshi Kon. I think a lot of his work could speak to this in various ways, but the thing that came to mind for me was the show Paranoia Agent, which
Yes.
I guess was in 2004. To me, that seems like maybe a pretty early example of something that is actually kind of addressing what you're talking about. So for the listener, if you're not familiar with this, and please correct me, it's been a couple years, so I'll probably misdescribe some of this. But my memory is that basically there is probably somewhere in the world in this story a boy with a bat who has hit someone in the head. That did really happen. But the idea of the boy with the bat who hits people in the head becomes such an outsized force in Japanese media in this anime that people start kind of creating him. He shows up in all sorts of places doing increasingly impossible things, and he represents a breakdown of the sense of what is real and what is possible that also leads to a lot of things that aren't apparently that connected. It's really an anthology show. And you have, so people are becoming ghosts in a way that they wouldn't have previously. Like a lot of weird things are happening because he kind of broke containment.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of like there's several like animes around that period of time that like all have very similar, like Serial Experiments Lane. There's a kind of masterpiece of like Philip K. Dick as paranoia. And then like Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, which is probably like the premium example of like secret agency detective fiction as a social commentary venue out there on the market. But a lot of these were kind of prompted by the emergence of the information era, which they defined in a very peculiar way. They defined it as simply being a mass interconnection of minds and channels. And those things all are connected together, like anomalies and artifacts start appearing. And that having all these things connected together creates things that didn't exist before, often from having no central cause. The idea of a standalone complex in the anime of the same name comes from like a copy without an original. So those address a different era of of electronic media, but they are very close to it. I think that one of the difficulties in literary fiction, I guess the closest I've read to this is 20 Days of Turin. That's like which is by Giorgio de Mora. It was written about the years of lead in Italy, and it has a proto-social media like thing called like an institution called the library, where people can leave diaries and then like anonymous diaries that you can read, and you can choose to quote unquote follow people by paying to de-anonymize them. And then after the library emerges, all these strange murders and typical weird fiction things happen. And the way that characters talk in the story is very, very, the psychological model of the person there is of the type of person who is sort of like who is kind of cut in from both ways, that they are seeing something constantly that on the outside is disturbing, irrational, but they also cannot speak of it. They cannot acknowledge it publicly. So they maintain sort of a forced self-censorship. And I always imagine that as being analogous to how a lot of people were during things like COVID and other things, where in fact, it was actually a topic of conversation among my friends, where they say that we all know on the outside everything's going batshit insane. But in like in business, in our families, we have to pretend that it's not. So in a sense, the containment becomes reversed, basically. And where, like in the Orthodox containment story, you have the things, like the creepy crawly things that are on kind of the inside, and you pretend on the outside they're not there. Whereas in the reverse thing, after they've come free, they're on the outside with you, and you have to pretend they're not there when you're on the inside. And the sort of double consciousness drives people insane. That's partially why a lot of people go nuts on platforms like Blue Skies, because they kind of get, on the one hand, that this sort of double conscious compartmentalization is psychologically unraveling and will hurt them. But they also don't understand that they can't drink from the fire hose at once. They don't necessarily have role models of people who are skilled at control. Kind of the model kind of hero or heroine of this type of story would not be someone who is reduced to babbling incoherence when they see the Cthulhu creature or whatever, and but also not a person who denies it exists. Like they see enough of the thing that cannot be described and describe it in the ways that it has to be appropriately described, and then they log off, and then they come back on. They understand they have an iterated engagement with this sort of thing. It's going to be back there waiting for them when they come back. But my friend Venkatesh Rao actually wrote about this kind of years ago and talking about his relationship sort of Trumpism. He says, like, I can't completely ignore this. I can't go to some cozy environment. But at the same time, I also can't let my life be dictated by it. And finding that balance of environmental information exposure is very difficult, but still necessary.
Yeah. No, that's hitting for me. I'm thinking about, so I work at a hospital, and I should be careful about how I talk about this exactly, but so I work in Iowa, work at a hospital in a red state. We are in this kind of weird position where, because of all of these really chaotic changes to policy, we're touched by all these strange legal decisions that are either made or half made, all these bizarre forces that have been sort of freed by the current regime, but we can't, both because it would be impossible to do the job in the way that it needs to be done, and because there are pressures from inside and from outside involved in being, employed by a public institution in a red state. We can't ever really allow ourselves to fully see it while we're working, right? We can't really, it would just be impossible to get anything done. Like when I go to work, I have to try to suspend my awareness of what's happening in Minneapolis, where, I live really close. I visit periodically. I have friends and loved ones. I think of it as a place where nice people I know go to live sometimes. That's my relationship to that city. And I have to, in order to function as a professional, just not know what's going on for hours at a time. Or, what I know, but I have to pretend I don't know. And it is very stressful to maintain that division that you're talking about, and to manage the ways in which necessarily sometimes you do have to acknowledge it, right? Because it's forcing decisions on you, even though those decisions are like, no one in any part of this process is ever quite acknowledging the power that they're bringing to bear on you, right? Like when the Trump administration decided to make rural hospitals a thing of the past, essentially, they didn't acknowledge that they were doing that. And in fact, they officially funded help for those institutions. And it is really difficult to navigate the things that I'm allowed to acknowledge, the things that I'm allowed to know, the things that I'm allowed to remember in any given moment. And sometimes you just sit there and it all hits you, and you don't know what to do. And yeah, if you're drinking from the fire hose, like you said, if you are just on Blue Sky and you're just reading all the worst news all the time, which sometimes I am, sometimes I lose a day that way, and it's not good for me.
It's very much in a sense democratizing the experience of having a security clearance in essence. I never got one, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't, because my friends all have to have credit monitoring because the Chinese took them during the OPM hack. But the experience of that is like having a divided self. One of the biggest reasons why leaks happen in DC is that there isn't really a very fine line between what people can reveal about their work and what they can't. And that there are very elaborate classification principles for how information is sorted, but like a lot of things happen like kind this is more of a before times thing than now, but kind of the stereotypical example is of like a guy who's bragging in a bar in Arlington or Alexandria, and he's trying to hit on this woman by trying to make it look like he's a super secret squirrel. And he's telling her things from his job that he kind of thinks he can get away with telling that are not going to get him in trouble. But maybe they're more revealing than he suspects. What he also doesn't know is that the woman he's talking to has a higher security clearance than he does, and she's just sort of laughing at him internally and humoring him. And meanwhile, there's a reporter who's just sitting there, just like a human microphone, and his job is just to hang out there and listen to people get drunk and talk about things they shouldn't. And this is going into tomorrow's paper. And that's sort of seen as a very common present one in DC. And it's also like how Stanley McChrystal got in trouble because the reporters hanging around him all the time, like drinking and hanging out when eventually something slips. So I think in a sense, the experience people have is suddenly being put in the actual role of someone who has top secret SCI clearance or something of that nature. But the problem is not that they're trying to withhold, oh, I can't speak about this sort of spy program or this particular technical thing that would give the Chinese or the Russians able to reverse engineer our shit. Rather, it's more or less, I'll suffer social consequences of various sorts if I acknowledge something that's right in front of my eyes. And it can't necessarily it's not just purely in the 1984 sense. It's also that maybe you create awkwardness in an environment full of other people where they can only get together and enjoy time with each other if they collectively pretend something's not happening. And you're suddenly the person that shits in like the bathtub or like whatever. And so
yeah.
people get used to like trying to hide things that they're seeing in a way. But of course, you can't really, for much for the same reason. There's often very fuzzy lines in what classified information holders can reveal and what they can't. You still run the same problem. It gets very stressful.
I feel like I'm very consciously negotiating my feelings about this problem in my social interactions with people generally, in that like I feel like most people that I hang out with offline on a day-to-day basis, they're generally, or they at least present themselves as if they're more comfortable if we don't acknowledge any of the stuff that's going on. And meanwhile, like for me, if I don't sort of begin the interaction with sort of a gesture at it, like we kind of did before I started
Yeah.
recording here, like I don't know how to interact with people without sort of setting that baseline of like we all kind of know, right? Like we're all kind of seeing this. So like I will often shit in the bath real quick just to get things started, and then we'll go from there, right? Like I briefly ruin the atmosphere, but it's so that I can relax for the interactions that follow. And I feel like everybody has different needs in that regard, and it's interesting and challenging to negotiate
Yeah,
that.
it's a common thing. I mean, obviously in DC, it's an omnipresent aspect of life, and that people know people who've been laid off by Doge, and another reason I hate kind of that organization is and it ruined a perfectly good Shiba Inu. Justice for Kabusu, and but I mean, yeah, like or like everyone, but even outside of that sort of thing, that I mean, there's always someone who's touched by something that you're not kind of aware of, and but we all have to maintain at least some distance from it, and it's very hard to know what that is and what that is or whatever. I mean, it's kind of on a related note. I never really feel that. How can I probably sort of best put this? So there's different ways of relating to the extreme, and for some people it's wanting to experience the most extreme emotions or experiences, and the idea of kind of fantasizing about yourself being Conan the Barbarian or whatever from your house, and you're kind of short-circuiting the part of being that because you want to imagine in an existential sense that you are. And I've been living kind of this sort of thing of on the one hand having a contained environment, on the other hand having constant exposure to extreme things in an existential sense. I do not understand this why anyone like fantasize about that. I really like the idea that I never dream I'm like a I'm a barbarian. I want to be a barbarian or I want to be like a tier one spec ops operator. I have a Steam application. I have this game on Steam. I open the game, I play it. I'm immersed in this world where I am briefly a mage, a SWAT guy kicking down a door, or like a detective, and then I come back to my life as is, I mean, as is, and it's kind of made me also want to kind of gain new appreciation for how managing my own life is an adventure in and of itself. That's actually important, rather than being fixated on being a part of some sort of far off thing that's superficially attractive. I'm not sure if you kind of get what I'm saying of that nature.
Yeah, no, I think so. I have a strong desire, and it's only been getting stronger to really lock things down and calm my life down. Like literally last week, I gave in to an urge I've been having in various forms for like a couple years now, and I got myself on Steam, not an exciting adventure simulator, but I got myself a little toy train game, and I loaded it up and I saw that they had, and to be clear, this is like last week, so this is after Christmas. I saw that there was a Christmas train layout because train guys call it they call them layouts. I've learned as I work on becoming a train guy myself, and I just went into the Christmas train layout and I watched a train decorated with some Christmas tree decals essentially go by in this really simplified snowy environment that was simulating like not even a block of city in the winter in the holiday season, and I felt so calm. Like I've got this another thing I'm doing now is I'm working on becoming a big tea guy. I don't know if
I
you
drink tea
so
constantly.
when I yeah, like I'm really trying to get deep into it. I'm just like trying to embrace all my most boring impulses because every time I don't have control over what's going on around me, it's a nightmare currently. Like all the not boring stuff is so much less boring than I ever wanted it to be. I would prefer to be in such a laid back, such a relaxing time. And I'm at the point now where I almost don't remember what it's like to feel calm as an adult. But I am so hostile to nostalgia, right? Like I really don't, when people get like they really miss being a kid, I find that really grating and off-putting. So I try not to indulge in that fantasy. But I am beginning to indulge in the fantasy of being an adult with just a normal functioning society around me that I don't feel like I have to keep an eye on at all times.
When I was growing up, I mean, the thing that I really loved was like video games were save rooms. Even like a because like you like the monsters are might be patrolling outside, but inside the save room, everything is perfect and peaceful. And I read an actual blog talking about how the musical theory aspect of how the scores that are in the save rooms are they have a undercurrent of tranquility, I mean, but also with an undercurrent of slight tension to remind you there are things outside. And I remember, like in particular, Legend of Zelda, like Ocarina of Time, we eventually get to sort of dystopian Hyrule, like castle, or whatever. There's this one guy who's just in a single room, and in the town where there's zombies wandering around, and it's a very tiny room, but it's the most coziest places in a game that I've ever seen and ever seen. Like I play a lot of Stalker too. I mean, it's set in kind of a fictional version of Chernobyl, and the like, and it's interesting is that like I mean, it's in like a place literally irradiated and full of mutants and like wilderness, but the actual towns where all these stalkers are hang out, they play guitar, they sing kind of Ukrainian song and everything. It's some of the most like pleasant and coziest places imaginable. I think it comes from sort of appreciating that much more simply because of having an exterior like that. But a bit sort of a related note, I'm kind of like curious, is you're kind of immersed somewhat in sort of like the weird fiction and horror and that kind of. I'm kind of curious what your opinion, what the future of these genres are in light of what's going on now.
That's a great question. I'm actually going to think for a second, and I'll just allow there to be a long silence that I'll edit out.
Yeah, I'll go on like because what prompted is at that. So like obviously there's kind of one undercurrent been going on for a while, been trying to sort of get the Lovecraft without H.P. Lovecraft and trying in a sense to take some of these aspects of this genre away from some of its racist roots. I know it's been a project that's been going on, but another one I think is more Lovecraft himself kind of summed up the essence of weird fiction. He said like we don't do clanking chains and ghosts here anymore. We want things that actually scare people. I don't like we like this sort of like this Victorian like Gothic shit that's played out. We're going full steam ahead, and we're going to do this stuff of that reminds people of how small and in the cold, heartless expanse of the universe. And that was to someone in like the early 1900s, that was the most terrifying thing imaginable. The other thing, most terrifying thing was the fish people, or whatever. That's a part of the Lovecraft stories I never could actually take seriously. I often imagine him like seeing his pet goldfish and then saying the grotesque creature maneuvered through is the aquatic expanse, its globulous
yeah.
eyes staring, and then and like the sad goldfish looking at like, HP, why do you hate me so much? Sad glub glub noises. but like, but like that, but sort of like, but now in a sense, people have all of these in a sense that I think part of the problem is on the one that you're kind of stuck between two different. Cyberpunk has this problem too, and that on the one hand, people have talked for like a long time about how aspects of this genre have now become troped to death. But at the same time, very basic cliches are also still relevant and viscerally applicable. So I guess maybe one problem is that even though for innovation, you like that there's a Janus face aspect to the horror. I mean, that one so this part that's kind of looking back at what we're already familiar with, and the, kind of the ways we have of describing the abnormalities of this aspect of the future isn't quite describable yet, at least like for writers.
The thing you said about the sort of tropification, that does speak to like one trajectory that I imagine things taking in the near future, which is a thing that I think you already see with all kinds of things, which is I feel like I know a lot of people who are, in my opinion, kind of shitty about fan fiction, who resent its reach and the fact that, like, so many, if you teach creative writing, which I do sometimes, you feel the presence of fan fiction's culture in the writing of your students, right? Like it reads a lot more like fan fiction than it used to, as some of the conventions there have, I guess, been more formalized, or maybe just more of your like normie population is more familiar with them is probably the reality. But like I feel like if you look at like shows on Netflix, you look at like where like the most mainstream stuff is happening now culturally, a lot of it feels like fan fiction to me. I've been playing a little bit of Claire
Yeah,
Obscure Expedition 33 with my partner, and to me it all feels like fan fiction. It feels to me like the whole world is sort of being created to facilitate the relationship to the characters that makes for the most powerful fan fiction. And I don't want to be shitty about this. I think that there's a lot to I think that there's a lot of positive things about what fan fiction emphasizes in storytelling, the fact that it does encourage people to think about their relationships to the characters and things like that. Like I think that can be nice, but I think it does also kind of it leads you off in a direction that is maybe hard to relate substantially back to actual life. I think maybe that's one of the things about it, is that it always feels like you're looking at a layer of fiction that was spun out from other fiction, that is commenting on it whether it knows it or not, that is about your awareness of fiction and your awareness of how other fans, it's aware, the show or the game or the story's awareness of the fandom and its desire to interact with the fandom. I think there's going to be a lot of strange fiction, a lot of weird fiction. There's going to be a lot of horror that is operating by that logic. There probably is already that I'm not aware of, that is going to feel as a result really toothless for people who do not want to engage in that way, who would like it to still have a kind of reference back to their daily life experience. If I had to guess for the other side of that cleave, I feel like we might have to go back to some pretty fundamental social realism. We might have to go back to really talking about the relationships between people, because I feel like that's where a lot of the thorny things are right now, right? The stuff that's happening to us culturally as communities, it's so big and outsized, and you really feel your sense of powerlessness with it in a way that can kind of shut down your ability to engage with it fictionally or in reality. But the experience of living with other people and trying to relate to other people in that challenging circumstance, that to me seems like rich territory where things could be scary and weird and interesting. I'm thinking about a story. Gosh, I'm not gonna. I'll have to remind myself later. This is Future Mike dropping in to say that the story I was thinking of was Successor, Usurper, Replacement by Alice Sola Kim. It's a Anyway, the story is about a bunch of young writers in New York City, and there's a monster outside, and there's also like a flood or something, and you have to not let the monster into your home, because if you do, it's gonna eat you or something. It's not totally clear. A creature that is in some way distinct from that monster infiltrates the apartment where these young writers are having this party, and it basically just like makes them aware of the cruel ways in which they've been treating each other, the ways that they have been using each other and substituting each other, in the way that people in their lives have been doing that. And to me, that kind of feels like the space that is rich for me right now. Is okay, we have this monster out there, we've got this horrible culture, we've got this awful environment, but how are the people in my life taking advantage of me? How are they helping me? How are they helping each other? What are they doing to exploit each other? That feels rich to me.
Yeah, the way I just kind of think about this is that I think kind of in contemporary fiction, there's kind of a bad dichotomy between big worlds and small people, basically. Whereas, like kind of like I mean that literary fiction writers have very small like things about of interpersonal relationships, often like this like inter but the kind of worlds that and the extent I relate to the world, it's kind of a world we're already familiar with, and it's kind of we see the characters. And then you have like big sprawling science fiction epics or whatever. And what you don't really see as much of is like something has a big world and small people. Where you're in like
Mm-hmm.
because you want to be in like cyberpunk thing, you want to be the council cowboy or whatever. And whereas like whereas it's like something that actually the game that the best example is a game actually called Valhalla Cyberpunk Bartender, where the premise of the game is very simple, that you are a bartender in a cyberpunk dystopia. All you do is mix drinks. That's the only way you have to interact with the world. Maybe you go back to your apartment and choose to maybe buy things or decorations, and you can read things that are going on the internet. But all your primary thing kind of you're basically in Rick's bar in Casablanca, and you're not Rick. You're the guy who makes the drinks. And so you see all these characters come through, hear about their personal lives and other things. But meanwhile, all these kind of chaotic things are going on the outside that you don't necessarily directly interact with. And that sort of it creates a very unique feeling that's very, very powerful, of one in which you are, again, at the purely local level, but you also can see how this big dystopian bad things are going on and how it eventually creeps into the lives of the people you're interacting with. And the flip side is that very small decisions you make about how to mix drinks can actually have outsized consequences in the personal lives of people. I mean, the slogan of the game is it's time to mix drinks and save lives. And that's sort of, but yeah, I mean, I think that but partially though it comes from that being people who are interested in building big worlds aren't really that interested in the small people in them as much. Whereas people who kind of make the small world, people interested into the small fiction, the small worlds of people, don't necessarily have as much of a big interest in sort of sweeping, grandiose epics. And they kind of the two things sort of need to come together a bit.
Yeah. So if memory serves, I that's in my that's in the category of game I bought on sale at some point and then did not get back to actually play. And I look at it every now and then and I think, yeah, I should probably play that. I hear it's good. If memory serves, that is not a Japanese game, but it is made in imitation
It's
of
made by people from Venezuela, actually.
Venezuela. Okay.
I mean, it's kind of like it is an example of kind of the fan fiction thing. Is that on the one hand,
Mm-hmm.
is a game that you will enjoy much more if you are immersed in weeb culture. There are
Right.
lots of very subtle references. For example, like the message board that the protagonist is reading constantly informs her view of the world is basically imitation of the Japanese two channel. And a lot of the characters are references to kind of classic animes or games or whatever. And but at the same time, you can kind of go into it with just only a vague idea of what a cyberpunk dystopia is, and you can enjoy it.
Right.
And it also kind of gets that I think that weeb culture is now very globalized. There's people from South America who make a game that really makes you feel like you're in a like you're in Neo Tokyo,
Right.
and people who very probably have advanced Japanese language proficiency.
Yeah, well, the thing that made me think of in terms of the conversation is that it does feel like anime and manga traditions do have a tool set that's pretty well established for telling the kind of story that you're talking about. In that, my sense is that the logic and grammar of the slice of life genre is so powerfully established there and so thoroughly developed that they can kind of apply it to any other genre and use it to kind of digest it a bit. I am struggling to think of exact examples. I mean, like Paranoid Agent would be one of those, but
There's a Motoko Tanaka has a great essay about this called Trends of Japanese Science Fiction in the 2000s. I've linked to it a lot of times on Blue Sky,
uh-huh.
which she talks about. It's also kind of her dissertation on Japanese apocalyptic science fiction. She isn't just anime and game, but mainly kind of also looks at novels like Japan Sinks or some of Haruki Murakami's work as well. But what kind of she talks about is sort of that Japan in like the 1990s ceased to become an imagined community that had space psychologically for people. It's a combination of the economic crash, natural disasters, like atomization of society, and like a antisocial incidents, and finally an act of terrorism by a cult on the Japanese subway system. People stopped being able to feel like they could inhabit a nation with other people as a grand space. They could have small little world networks, which correspond to them, their friends, people they know at work, their love lives, their families. But there's a distance, but these middle ground disappeared. So what she kind of talks about is how, because of that, there's a prevalence of stories that kind of there's a short in which the social institutions are taken out. There's a short circuit effect. Evangelion is the classic example of this because you have which the struggles of a very, very, very dysfunctional teenage boy and his immediate family, a Kare family, is something that literally determines the fate of the universe. And there's a very big through line between Shinji Ikari's psychological struggles, which are very intensely psychoanalytical. And the story is kind of like a combination of a slice of life story coexisting with a mecha thing, and it just breaks down over time progressively. And there are other worse examples of it, but I feel like that sort of is a good, I mean, that you do have to some point bring the middle end of social institutions back. But for an environment today we live in, which is very similar, of losing a kind of sense of a middle ground existing, I think it's a very powerful, dramatic device of having the ability to have, okay, you're in the middle of a post-apocalyptic universe or whatever, but you still have these little slice of life adventures. And there's also kind of a particular Japanese style of storytelling that I tend to actually have gotten habituated to, both from reading Japanese fiction and from watching anime and movies. It's not a three-act structure. It's a four-act one, where at the very beginning you have an introduction to the characters and the setting, an elaboration of what you've seen, which you kind of like, in which you just know, and suddenly in the third act, there's a shocking, sudden twist that kind of calls into question everything you know about everything you just saw. And then the fourth act is just a reconciliation of what you know in the third act, what you know in the beginning. And a lot of how that times it works in animes is that you have often you think it's a very great because suddenly the ground is pulled out from under you after you've gotten used to the universe, and it's often because it's often because of the machinations of a villain or something else in the background you can hear distant echoes of. And finally, in the third act, your ability to ignore it collapses and just completely. You can see actually how well this works if you watch the adaptation of Count of Monte Cristo, that makes a lot of stylistic changes to it. But the main biggest is it tells the story from Albert Morchev's point of view rather than the Count. So it becomes more like a slasher novel where you have this bunch of this guy's hanging out with his friends. This weird, quirky man in a cape and a strange hat comes in the picture, is very rich, and suddenly people start dropping.
Yeah.
And then finally, the disturbing twist is Albert learning about actually that yes, I mean that all of this is happening because the world he's built on is a lie. Like his father got put another man in prison to be able to be with his mother. All these people are corrupt, and the entire prosperity his life's been built on has been built off an immense crime. And but having knowledge, it's much more powerful dramatically for me experiencing it that way than you do in the actual novel.
I started the novel and it started slow, and I did not get through it. It's another on the list, but I've seen the adaptation you're referring to, and it is a wild ride. I feel like that one, I haven't heard anybody mention that one in a long time. I'd kind of forgotten it existed. I feel like it kind of dropped out of the collective memory. But that one is, I'm trying to remember the visual style on that one is really interesting too in a way I can't.
It's like a Studio Gonzo. Like they have it. It was a combination of kind of Rococo hand painted things with computer animation.
Yeah.
It worked very well.
Yeah, no, that one was a striking experience, but it has been literally, I feel like it's been since I think I watched it in grad school. So that'd be like 2009 or 10, probably.
The other trend I kind of think about is obviously serial fiction. I mean, there's a big for 19th century that. I mean, in this book, there is no anti-memetics originally was serialized, and some people I know have actually complained about the actual. I mean, they say that it's kind of very too obviously a serialized thing has been composed post hoc into a novel. And my bit of a chuckle if someone is familiar with 19th century literature is like, yeah, first time experience meme with like the person being hung.
Yeah.
at the very at the very like I mean you could say I mean whatever kind of the faults I've been noticing at least kind of the QNTM doesn't have like elaborate kind of descriptions of things that go on pages and pages or like to pad the word length.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
But I mean I do feel that serial fiction is kind of coming back both because of the economics of publishing, but also like the way manga and light novels work is very serialized. And so kind of going back to the fan fiction thing, I think kind of light novels are one of the biggest influences on how your creative writing students see things, even if they haven't really directly experienced them. So because so just like what those are, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty much.
They're not really equivalent to young adult not fiction in America, and that they are like, but they're called light in the sense that they're not really, I mean, just they're actually just into the prose is not dense, and there are
Right.
pictures in them. But like the way they often work is so like is that you kind of have a premise that's kind of then serialized, and they often have it's very formulaic at times. And kind of a typical one is reincarnated as a space mercenary. I was once a loser. Now I have the coolest spaceship. And then on the cover of the book, there's a picture of this guy who's a space mercenary with kind of this blaster, and there's a cat girl on one arm, and then a fox girl on the other, both like beautiful space aliens. But a lot of like anime does originate as from light novels, some of which could be very, very like emotionally rich. But I think kind of the light novel formula and the formula is something that the idea of having some particular dramatic niche and at particular conventions that people have to get used to or expecting, and kind of like as something that's very familiar from 19th century fiction popularization of it. And it's also, and a lot of it also originated itself as fan fiction. They like do like both manga and like light novel writing in Japan. There's a very big pipeline you don't necessarily see here of fan fiction to actual original creative work. The only prominent example of it I can think of is Fifty Shades of Grey.
Right.
I do think we'll probably see more of that because I do think kind of if publishing industry has to sort of adapt to more of the fan fiction wave and trying to find a way to coax kind of people out of being able to only write about these things and try to broaden the nature of the experience, kind of that the fan fiction is kind of an entree point, but then make it so like a much try to sense deepen or take what I find that sort of like that kind of helpful things to kind of think about what actually attracted you about the specific original story and what I mean to begin with, and then and then there's some aspect of that you don't necessarily have to copy, but to have it set in the same world, you can kind of create for yourself. The emotions or aesthetic are not really independent of them. You can create if you really like Michael Mann movies and the sort of the slow burning effect of crooks and cops chasing each other and and kind of technically accurate gunfights and that sort of and being in that kind of world, you can make something like that without it being a heat fan fiction. If you
Right.
like kind of like of course, sort of like, and of course, like if you like Dracula and the Gothic experience or whatever, and you don't necessarily have to make it a thing about Dracula. You just have this think about kind of the emotion of discomfort as attraction and repulsion simultaneously. Those sort of
Yeah.
thing. I think that that fan fiction writers probably have to be on board, be able to see that, which is very hard unless you actually read literature outside of it.
Yes. I think in relationship to this about the way that superhero fiction has evolved over the last few decades, where partly because it is such a like superhero comics are a really narrow genre in a lot of ways that have very specific things that they do. So even when they weren't self-consciously fan fiction, they often pretty much were fan fiction. But you had that series of like, you got Alan Moore doing Watchmen, doing the Supreme comic that was pretty much Superman fan fiction, where they got really good, I feel like, for a while at doing what was essentially fan fiction in terms of I'm going to take the things that were most interesting to me about Superman, about Batman, about whatever, and I'm going to recontextualize them and I'm going to put them in my own place, and they're going to be my version is going to be as original as it needs to be to do what I want to do, and it's going to be as reliant as it wants to be on your knowledge of Superman or the strengths of these other canons. And there was a period where it felt to me like mainstream culture fiction was becoming productively comfortable with that sort of approach, with saying like, well, I mean, you know what this is. Like,
Yeah.
basically, I'm doing Sherlock Holmes. Remember that? This is pretty
Yeah.
much that, but it's a little bit different, and here's what I'm doing. And it was pretty comfortable. I felt like we were more comfortable arriving at original places by that method. And I think it's true that with fan fiction becoming so much, and in some cases, in a lot of cases, basically all that young writers are reading in a lot of cases, that skill has been submerged again a little bit. People are maybe not as comfortable with that leap of, all right, I've been practicing by writing about this established character, this established universe. Now I'm going to pretty much continue doing that, but it's my thing, and I'm doing it in the way that is allowing me to get to the things that I couldn't do just by imitating what I've enjoyed up to this point.
Part of the problem is people's have a kind of a harmful relationship to, again, like a language of fandom is like when I learned about deconstruction, it was Derrida and French theory and kind of in college. And whereas like if you talk to people online in fandom culture, deconstruction is more like a Looney Tunes character with Acme TNT. They're taking some aspect of a genre and blowing it up, usually because they don't like it. And it's like, I'm going to deconstruct this story because this trope is harmful. And it's like it's sort of an iconoclastic thing, and sometimes it can create a very bad impression of how to read things. Often, like people, it's where people say, "Oh, Hideki Anno hates otaku," and that could be completely further from the truth because Hideki Anno was a consummate otaku, and after he became famous from Evangelion, he just became like I want to play with my toys. I'm gonna make a Shin Godzilla movie, I'm gonna make Shin Kamen Rider. But like what they miss about deconstruction in that sort of way is that what they're trying to think is they maybe kind of the right impulse a little, but they kind of think, well, market is becoming oversaturated in a certain way. This become taken for granted. What they kind of then, but the logical leap that they make, which is bad, is that okay, this genre element is bad. I have to destroy it. It's being iconoclast. I have to tear it all down and make anyone who enjoys it as bad. Whereas a lot of the people who are best at doing what people say is deconstruction are more kind of operating in the mode of this genre has been saturated. In order to make technical progress in it, you have to be able to do something different and re-examine assumptions. Again, going back to Lovecraft, even though he was a fan of Gothic literature. I mean, there's a lot of early. I do have one of the books when I'm reading here, like Eldritch, kind of a collection of kind of lesser known Lovecraft stories called Eldritch Things. And where you can see a lot of his early short stories are very much kind of operating in a Gothic mode. Whereas he has more idea that in order to take this to the state of the art, I need to be able to leave this behind. And I think it's a mindset that's hard for people to get because because fandom culture also is very binary. Either you're for something or against it. And like a pro or anti, like a term like ship or wars, whatever. I'm pro the ship or against it. And I think when people I think people are easier to get back at it, but when they think of themselves not as being someone who has to either create something that's totally new or tear it down, more of this idea of taking tools or settings or things that have already been established and then trying to take them to the next level. I mean, there was a very kind of a screen grab of someone I saw some weeks ago saying they felt very bad because they're trying to write a novel and if the plot had already been done. And the author of the novel said, no, I mean, it does just because I wrote the things with the same plot doesn't mean you can't write this and take it in a way that I didn't and right. Find a way to improve on it. And I think that's kind of like, I mean, I think kind of in general that people never really got used to the idea that you can stand on the shoulders of giants. That's a really big, proud thing to do. It's a really great thing to do. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But you can make a better wheel.
That feels like a great concluding point. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I think it's going to be really interesting for listeners. I've got a number of things I want to follow up and read. When we end the show, and I'm always in the market for a better sign off because this one happened by mistake. But what we say now to end the show is thank you, Tony, which is a way of thanking my male cat who is not in the room and has not contributed to the show. I don't know why we've been thanking him, but we have been. So unless you would like to recommend a better sign off, which I would enjoy, I will say thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.